Machine Learning in Python, Clustering. By the end of this video, you should be able to articulate the goal of cluster analysis, discuss whether cluster analysis is supervised or unsupervised, and list some ways the cluster results can be applied. In cluster analysis, as you would remember, the goal is to organize similar items in your dataset into groups or clusters. By segmenting your data into clusters, you can analyze each cluster more carefully. Note that the cluster analysis is also referred to as clustering. A very common application of cluster analysis that we have discussed before is to divide your customer base into segments based on their purchase histories. Some other examples of cluster analysis are characterization of different weather patterns for a region, grouping the latest news articles into topics to identify the trending topics of the day, and discovering hotspots for different types of crime from police reports in order to provide sufficient police presence for problem areas. Cluster analysis divides all the samples in a dataset into groups. In this diagram, we see that the red, green, and purple data points are clustered together. Which group a sample is placed in is based on some measure of similarity. The goal of cluster analysis is to segment data so that the differences between samples in the same cluster are minimized, as shown by the blue arrow for our yellow dots. And the differences between samples of different clusters are maximized, as shown by the blue arrow between the red and yellow dots. Visually, you can think of this as getting samples in each cluster to be as close as possible, and the samples from different clusters to be as far apart as possible. Cluster analysis requires some sort of metric to measure similarity between two samples. Some common similarity measures are Euclidean distance, which is the distance along a straight line between 2 points A and B as shown in this plot. Manhattan distance, which is calculated on a strictly horizontal and vertical path as shown in the right plot. To go from point A to point B, you can only step along either the x-axis or the y-axis in the two-dimensional case. So the path to calculate the Manhattan distance consists of segments along the axis instead of along a diagonal path as with the Euclidean distance. Cosine similarity measures the cosine of the angle between points A and B as shown in the bottom plot. Since distance measures such as Euclidean distance are often used to measure similarity between samples in clustering algorithms, note that it may be necessary to normalize the input variables so that no one value dominates the similarity calculation. We discussed scaling and normalizing variables in an earlier video. Normalizing is one method to scale variables. Essentially, scaling the input variables puts the variables on the same scale so that all variables have equal weighting in the calculation to determine similarity between samples. Scaling is necessary when you have variables that have very different scales, such as weight and height. The magnitude of the weight values, which are in pounds, will be much larger than the magnitude of the height values, which are in feet and inches. So scaling both variables to a common value range will make the contributions from both weight and height equal. Some things to note about cluster analysis are, first, unlike classification and regression in general, cluster analysis is an unsupervised task. This means that there is no target label for any sample in the dataset. In general, there is no correct clustering results. The best set of clusters is highly dependent on the application, how the resulting clusters will be used. There are numerical measures to compare two different clusters, but since there are no labels to determine whether a sample has been correctly clustered, there is no ground truth to determine if a set of clustering results are truly correct or incorrect. Clusters don't come with labels. You may end up with 5 different clusters at the end of cluster analysis process, but you don't know what each cluster represents. Only by analyzing the samples in each cluster further, you can come up with reasonable labels for your clusters. Given all this, it is important to keep in mind that interpretation and analysis of the clusters are required to make sense of and make use of the results of cluster analysis. There are several ways that the results of cluster analysis can be used. The most obvious is data segmentation and how the benefits that come from that. If you segment your customer base into different types of readers, for example, analyzing each segment separately, can provide valuable insights into each group's likes, dislikes, and purchasing behavior, just like we see science fiction, non-fiction, children's book preferences here. These insights can be used to provide more effective marketing to different customer groups based on their preferences. Clusters can also be used to classify new data samples. When a sample is received, like the orange sample here, compute the similarity measure between it and the centers of all clusters and assign the new sample to the closest cluster. The label of cluster, manually determined through analysis, is then used to classify the new sample. In our book buyer's preferences example, a new customer can be classified as being either a science fiction, non-fiction, or a children's book customer based on which cluster the new customer is most similar to. Once cluster labels have been determined, samples in each cluster can be used as label data for another classification task. The samples would be the input to the classification model, and the cluster label would be the target class for each sample. This process can be used to provide much needed label data for classification. Yet another use of cluster results is as a basis for anomaly detection. If a sample is very far away or very different from any of the cluster centers, like the green sample here, then that sample is a cluster outlier and can be flagged as anomaly. However, these anomalies require further analysis. Depending on the application, these anomalies can be considered noise and should be removed from the dataset. An example of this would be a sample with value of 150 for age. For other cases, these anomalous cases should be studied more carefully. Examples of this are in a credit card fraud detection or network intrusion detection application. In these applications, examples outside of the norm are the interesting cases that should be looked at to determine if they represent potential problems. To summarize, cluster analysis is used to organize similar data items into groups or clusters. Analyzing the resulting clusters often leads to useful insights about the characteristics of each group, as well as the underlying structure of the entire dataset. Clusters require analysis and interpretation to make sense of the results, since there are no labels associated with the samples or clusters in a clustering task. In the next video, we will discuss a specific algorithm for cluster analysis.